Our scripture reading today is from Luke chapter 19 from verse 1. Jesus and Zacchaeus. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your place today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He is gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Your word, O Lord, is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path.
Well, good morning everyone, and thank you, Lorraine, for your welcome this morning. For those that are visitors, I'm sort of run off the bench onto the field every year, this time of the year. Graham makes sure that happens well before January. But it's the first time that I'm conducting communion here. The order might be a little different, but most of the responses are the same. Shouldn't be a problem. One thing that haven't checked on yet, you're a bit of a challenge here with the screens, you know, because I need these glasses to read that screen, and I think I need I know I need these glasses to read what's on here, and I can read that there as well. That's great. Well, one topic that almost everyone has an opinion about, it's a bit like the weather, is taxation, the taxes we pay. And I think Benjamin Franklin was the one who said, there are only 2 certainties in life, aren't there? Death and taxes. Generally, we become resigned, I think. Most of us don't like paying tax, but we're resigned to the fact that it's a good thing, we should be doing it. Although someone quipped once, earning money would be a pleasure were it not so taxing. His marginal rate must have been too high. But every now and again the tax issues arise and feelings become quite heightened, both for the taxpayers and the tax collectors. In our case it's the Australian Tax Office. Only just a week or 2 ago, right here in the middle of this holiday season, the Australian Tax Office issued a media release telling everybody that they were going to sharply increase travel bans on people. I'd never heard of them. But they're known as departure prohibition orders, and they prevent individuals with a serious tax debt from going on a holiday and not coming back. Taxpayers with significant debts who think they can skip the country without paying what is owed to the community should think again, the Assistant Tax Commissioner was reported as saying. Well, I'm on the Commissioner's side. I'm sure we all are. So feelings can run fairly high around tax. Febrile, I think, is the word, giving rise to excitement and nervous energy. Well, that reading from John's Gospel, from Luke's Gospel, that John read, there was quite a bit of excitement and nervous energy in what was a prosperous town of Jericho, not far from Jerusalem. And in this case, we'll see later, quite a lot of the excitement and nervous energy was generated by the issue of tax. But for the moment, there was movement at the station in the main street of Jericho, for the word had got around that this preacher from Galilee, up in the north part of Israel, that he was in town. And Jesus' reputation, I think, went before him. A lot of people had heard about him. And he'd not really come down south. Jerusalem's in the south, Galilee, where Jesus ministers, in the north. Not come down south much at all. Not to Jericho, at least, probably before. So there was excitement amongst the residents, and a crowd had gathered, and a crowd tends to beget a crowd, doesn't it? Well, what are they all looking at? And so it sort of builds. Well, our Bible reading focuses, though, on one member who was particularly excited that Jesus was in town. And that was Jericho's chief tax collector. Note the word chief, Zacchaeus. Being a chief or superintendent tax collector means that the Roman government, the occupying Roman Empire, Zacchaeus had won a contract with the government to farm, they called it, the Romans, or raise taxes from an area, Jericho and surrounds, no doubt. And so Zacchaeus employed people to do the tax collecting. And Jericho was built around a spring in what's otherwise fairly desert area. It was very productive in crops, irrigated fields and orchards, balsam oil plantations, made it a wealthy place. Little wonder that Zacchaeus collected quite a lot of tax, and when he took his cut, he ended up very rich, as Luke notices, draws to our attention. Zacchaeus was rich. But what explains Zacchaeus' extraordinary keenness to see Jesus, such that he climbed up a tree? Oh, well, now you say, I know this story so well, that's easy to answer. It's because he was short and the crowd were preventing him seeing Jesus. But my guess is that there is another element to Zacchaeus' excitement. We know that at the beginning of his ministry, up there in Israel, northern Israel, in Galilee, at Capernaum in fact, Jesus recruited a tax collector to be one of his 12, Matthew, or he became known as Matthew, originally Levi. That appointment itself, seeing as tax collectors were despised outcasts, as you can imagine, that appointment of Matthew was noteworthy, but also controversial. It stirred up quite a lot of nervous energy amongst the Pharisees. So I suggest it's quite likely that the news of this appointment had spread far and wide, particularly amongst the tax collecting fraternity in Israel. I can almost hear Zacchaeus saying, when he heard that Jesus was in town, got his tax collector people around, or a few that were there, this fellow Jesus, this rabbi, this teacher that's just come into town, he's got one of us on his team. So an already febrile situation was about to jump to an even higher level. Jesus indeed does walk under the tree that Zacchaeus climbs. But then, to the consternation of the crowd, Jesus calls out, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." That house of Zacchaeus, one biblical scholar rightly, in my view, surmises it was probably a lush villa with a courtyard, palms, water features and bathing facilities. Probably would have been one of the finest dwellings in Jericho. Well, going to stay at Zacchaeus' house went off with the crowd like a lead balloon, didn't it? To a person, Luke records, not just a few, not just some, all the crowd were, what does he say? All who saw it began to grumble. But Jesus was undeterred. Jesus, on this occasion, has left people either very annoyed or scratching their heads. What's going on? Now, to understand Jesus' approach to tax collectors, and Levi and or Matthew and Zacchaeus were probably just representative of his treatment generally of tax collectors. To do that, we need to spend a bit of time understanding the taxes and how destructive they were on the Jewish people of Jesus' day. Now, I originally trained as an accountant, so I realise this, well, it gives me some knowledge, yes, but it gives me an interest that probably is not shared by the majority of you here this morning. You know, old accountants never die, we just lose our balance. But I want you to bear with me. I hope you find it reasonably interesting. Israel, under the occupation of the Roman Empire, had to control a vast geographical area. Well, it ended up controlling all of the Mediterranean Sea and all the basin, all the countries around it and more, including today's Britain and Germany. And to take over and govern such a vast area required a big, well-equipped army. You can imagine. So the empire instituted a robust taxation regime with many components. The key one you've probably heard, because Jesus was challenged about it by the Pharisees and others, the key one was what was known as the annual tribute, the Roman tribute. It was a head tax, a poll tax. You were just taxed because you lived. But of course the emperor wanted to know and understand all the adults that were in his empire. So that explains in the birth story that Luke told, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, you remember, and so Joseph and Mary had to move with the little, for Jesus to be born. But why the census by the emperor? So he could levy a tax. And woe betide if you didn't register for the tax, and woe betide if you were found registered but had not paid. You usually found yourself at the end of a sword, or your house was likely burnt down. They were savage in enforcing these taxes. But there are other taxes levied by the Romans. On top of the annual head tax, the tribute, there were custom duties levied on the transport of goods, so tax collectors positioned themselves at a crossroad and took a customs duty. There were taxes on crops. Scholars estimate these taxes were 20% of the average worker's value of what they produced, of their subsistence income for the most part, and that most of the population were peasants. Most people, they earned a living off the land. They had crops, wheat, olives and vineyards, or they grazed sheep, cattle, goats. Others lived off fishing. The fishing industry was a big part of the economy in Israel. Some of those fishermen had assets, and so they were in a family business and they owned boats, but most didn't. The vast majority of the population in the fishing sector were labourers, net menders, boat maintainers, that sort of thing. Some people inherited, going back to farming, small blocks of land, but they were generally few and far between. The vast bulk of the population were either field workers on land owned by foreigners, or they were farm day labourers who were never sure whether they had a job today or tomorrow. They'd have to line up and wait to be selected. Others were artisans, carpenters like Jesus. Others working in transport. Others were shepherds, so on. These people, the masses, they lived in small villages scattered all around Galilee. And that is to be contrasted with, and I quote here an Australian scholar, the peasants, the masses, were in villages in the countryside, but a small urban-based elite of the governing class and their retainers, that's bureaucrats, were able to live in relative comfort off the exploitation of the agrarian labour of the peasantry. But here's the thing, the Roman taxes were not the only taxes the peasants paid. This was a big problem. There was a temple tax, two sizable Jewish taxes in fact, 10% of all agricultural produce, and another annual head tax. It was known in Israel as the temple tax, levied on every male Jew above 20 years of age. Now I've just listed for you 5 separate taxes. The scholars estimate this comes to about a taxing of subsistence people living from hand to mouth, of around 40%. 40% of what they produced or grew. And they were really just trying to feed their families and house and clothe them. It meant no sooner had a worker got his pay, in either kind or in coins, then along came the tax man and took 40% of it back. Now you see it, now you don't, sort of thing. It really amounted to an elaborate form of slavery for the vast majority of the Jewish public. And of course there was no social welfare net, so few were sick, few were elderly, infirm, mentally ill, disabled, widowed. You were very poor in that case. So economic inequality in Jesus' day was huge. You had the quite small affluent upper class living in the urban cities like Sepphoris and Tiberias, in Galilee and Jericho, down south, and you had the vast bulk of the population living near subsistence level in the rural countryside. Now the point is, this injustice of this enforced poverty on the masses, Jesus understood very clearly. This was not God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus, as with the Old Testament prophets before him, in seeking to reflect God's love to the world, was very preoccupied with the plight of the poor in Israel. The oppressed, those who were being dudded by the system. We know the poor was a priority for Jesus for what he taught and what he said and where he ministered. Remember the parable of the rich man and Lazarus? Remember the account of Jesus watching people making donations in the temple treasury? And he said of the poor widow, truly he was talking to his disciples, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are putting money into treasury, for they gave out of their abundance, that would be the urban elite, but she out of her poverty. Blessed are you poor, he preached. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. The voluntary government of God that I'm wanting to create on earth, you're the beneficiaries. He wanted a society that was governed and organised as if God were king, not the emperor, not the high priests in the temple. So Jesus' love, you see, it's included this, what I call thoughtful, discerning love, astute love, thinking love. Yes, at times it was occasional and spontaneous and probably emotional if he came across a blind person Or what about the time he was in the house and he suddenly gets lowered before him, a disabled person on a stretcher? But our reading today is a great example of Jesus' thoughtful, discerning love. Zacchaeus, hurry, come down. I must stay at your place today. And the result? The outcome? Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. What a great outcome. For some poor, at least, in Jericho on that day. Zacchaeus was a rich man. Maybe in today's dollars, say he was worth, 40 to 50 million. Well, that's 25 million made available to the poor. And it's worth noting that about Jesus' thoughtful, discerning love for his fellow suffering Jews. He thought enough to know that it was foolhardy and futile to try and take on the oppressive Roman tax system head on. But what Jesus and his movement could do was subtly undermine it or limit its capacity to damage the population. Because by recruiting tax collectors, who consequently not only acted within the law, as Zacchaeus also promised, but gave generously out of their surplus possessions to the poor, who were suffering so much indignity at not being able to feed and clothe and house themselves and their families. Well, we began by noting how excited Zacchaeus and others were to see Jesus, how feelings were running high. But something happened between the time that the excited Zacchaeus came down from the tree and the point where he finally announced his new direction in his life. Jesus let him know something very factual, something quite serious, not emotional, not exciting, but it was this, that if Zacchaeus wanted a restored relationship with God, he needed to discern, to assess, to understand the part that he was playing in the systemic suffering of fellow human beings. Social justice, you see, it's not an optional extra for our discipleship. It's integral to what Christ calls us to do. Jesus calls us to think hard about how we live in a heating world of heat waves, floods and fires. We've had plenty of those in the last week or two, haven't we? To question ourselves, and these terrible weather events hit poor people, low-income people, the hardest. They're least able to prepare and least able to recover. Are we doing all we can to limit our own personal greenhouse gas emissions? Slave labour abounds in many parts of our world. Do we, as followers of Jesus, ensure we don't buy goods that are made with slave labour? First Nations young people are amongst the most disadvantaged in our society. Do we make sure we do not support candidates for Parliament who want to increase the imprisonment of Aboriginal young people and lock even more of them up in prison, brutalising them even further? That's the challenge for Jesus' disciples in our reading today. May God grant to us thoughtful, discerning minds, the mind of Jesus Christ, so that we can play our part in the extension of his kingdom of God on earth. Amen.